Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Basically Everything, a podcast where teens and Gen Z share their insights and opinions on the issues that our world is facing. We view these topics from different perspectives, and we hope to inspire teens across the world to learn and grow while also being able to emerge with new information. Without further ado, let's get into our episode.
Hi, I'm Sherry.
I'm Archie.
And we're your hosts for this episode of Basically Everything.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about something you have probably encountered multiple times throughout your life, whether you're aware of it or not. I mean, it's a feeling that you must have experienced through friends, colleagues, family, and even with strangers on the street. It's something that you can give, receive, and misuse.
That sounds interesting. What is it?
It's peer pressure. And yes, I know you might be wondering, wait, but how can it be something that you can experience through strangers? And how can it help you? Isn't peer pressure bad?
That's something that we'll be learning about later in the episode. However, there's someone who can help us all learn more about peer pressure. Introducing our guest speaker, Allene Yue. Allene is a student entrepreneur from the Bay Area, California. She founded Empowering Youth in Business and Self-Care Support, and she loves to involve herself in volunteer work, especially those focused on educational sectors. She serves on the leadership team of nonprofits like Interns for Good and No Love, but in her free time, she enjoys taking walks with her sister and traveling wherever she can.
Thank you, Sherry, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions you guys have for me.
Now, I know most of us interact with others for many things daily, such as school, homework, video games, and music. Even the food we eat can be impacted by our peers and those around us. In fact, even the simplest things can be a result of someone else's influence. For example, you might find yourself holding the door for people when you are going in or out of a building. But if you think about it, no one really ever told you to. You probably started doing this because you saw someone else do it and you thought it was kind and respectful.
This is a phenomenon known as peer pressure. As Archie said earlier, there are many kinds of peer pressure. Some forms include spoken and unspoken, direct and indirect, and negative and positive. In today's episode, we'll be going more in depth about what peer pressure actually is and how it actually plays a bigger role in our everyday lives than we might think.
So, Allene, how would you describe peer pressure to someone who has never heard about it?
So I guess I would probably say, in simple terms, peer pressure is basically when you feel influenced to do something that maybe you wouldn't otherwise do if you didn't have that influence. And sometimes, as you mentioned before, you might not even really realize that you're being peer pressured into doing something. So, for example, you could be doing something to gain someone else's respect or just general acceptance or validation, I guess, in a way. And it puts you in this situation where I guess it's hard for you to say no, or it's hard for you to make a decision solely based on what you actually want to do. And as you mentioned before, it really comes in all different types of forms. So I'm sure we'll kind of talk a little bit more about it later, but I think that's kind of just a general description or definition of peer pressure that I would give.
That's great. So what do you think people are affected by peer pressure every day? What are some factors that you think could contribute to this phenomenon?
So I think personally that there's kind of a domino effect when it comes to peer pressure. I think it really only takes one person to pressure someone else into doing something. And that could be pressuring someone else to do something. So for example, if you were to be peer pressured into peer pressuring someone else to do something they don't want to do, which is kind of confusing, but it just leads to this kind of never-ending domino effect where just that one person can influence more and more people to do something that they're uncomfortable with. And then this problem of peer pressure just becomes super normalized because you can be peer pressuring someone without really knowing it. And you can also be on the other receiving end of it where you are the one being peer pressured and you don't know it. I think peer pressure also is especially common among students, whether that's in elementary, middle school, high school, or college. I think, of course, it's toned down in elementary school where topics of pressure are a bit less serious, but it's definitely introduced as early as when you're first in elementary school. And I feel like it's just a huge problem because this idea of peer pressure is exposed to students super early on, where they feel like they have to fit in or they have to go with the crowd because they just so desperately want to feel like they're not being judged. And I think people think that if they just go with whatever everyone else is doing, it's less stress or less drama, believing that you're not in the spotlight of just, having judgment from others. But what actually ends up happening is you get more stress from doing things you don't want to actually be doing. So I guess that's kind of my answer to that question.
Amazing. Yeah, I completely agree with you with the analogy of the domino effect. What are some ways someone could give or receive peer pressure?
Yeah, so as I talked a little bit about it before, I think peer pressure definitely starts when you're really young. And that means that it can also be pretty unexpected. So I'll kind of take an example from my life, for example. And when I talk about this story, it'll seem really silly, but I think that's kind of what peer pressure is. It makes these really minuscule little topics or stress or worries into something that becomes a huge problem in your life, and it brings a lot of stress. So take elementary school, for example. I remember when I was maybe in second grade, um, this was a situation where I think every girl in my class had a specific backpack from just a random store, probably Pottery Barn or something. Um, it was just like a hybrid roller backpack and normal backpack at the same time, but everyone had one. So I think everyone felt like they couldn't be that person with just a normal backpack. And so I felt like I had to get what everyone else was getting. And so I asked my parents if I could get one, and they agreed. But I think what ended up happening was, even though they bought the right backpack from the right store, it was just like a little bit smaller in size than what the other kids in my class had. I think it was just a smaller model, but I I honestly don't remember why, but I was just so upset and so embarrassed. I think I ended up even like crying about it, and it became like such a central focus in my life. And of course, like my parents ended up buying me the larger model because of how upset I was. But like looking back on it now, I just find it so stupid how having the wrong sized backpack became like the biggest problem or struggle in my life just because I wanted to be the same as everyone else. And it's the same thing when you're older, and these minuscule problems become just like the focus of your life just because, other people are doing something, and then you have this idea of peer pressure that takes place. So it's kind of the same thing in high school or middle school, for example. Um, Obviously straying from the backpack example, but if you have a competitive high school, for example, and you attend that high school, and maybe you're trying your absolute hardest to get perfect grades, you really have to ask yourself if you personally just want good grades for yourself, or if that's because all your friends or peers are also trying to get good grades and they're also trying to get into a prestigious college, and balance what seems like a million things at once. And I think that idea of competition kind of ties into peer pressure because it makes you feel like you have to do it all too. And that's something that brings a lot of stress into your life and really has a detrimental impact to your mental health. Um, and I mean, obviously, like you could be doing a lot of it for yourself, but you also feel bad when a friend gets a better grade than you, or does better in a competition than you. And I think that's just another example of unintended peer pressure, which happens a lot in society. Um, and you just kind of, again, have this domino effect where one person shares their grade, another person shares their grade, and everyone feels pressured to share their grades or at least do well on a test so that they can be proud of the grades that they're sharing. So I think that's kind of an example of, ways people can both give and receive peer pressure, because it's super easy to be on the receiving end of that, but also be the one actually peer pressuring someone else without even knowing it.
Yeah, so I can totally relate to the grade competition kind of scenario. So adding on, can you tell us a little bit more about the different sides to peer pressure, like the positives and the negatives of peer pressure?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up because I think peer pressure is generally seen as a negative term for the most part. And the way I've been talking about all of it has also made it seem just really negative in general, which it definitely is a lot of the time. But I think it's mostly about the people in your life or the people that you surround yourself by, or just the people you even choose to think about. Because when you surround yourself with good people or a good support system who makes good decisions and, doesn't have that toxicity, that can lead to positive peer pressure. And, for example, it could encourage you to make less impulsive decisions. It could really help you to grow your character in a positive way. And just a lot of, similar things like that, that really help you to improve your character instead of, tearing it down. So, for example, it's not so bad if a friend encourages you to break a bad habit, whether intentionally or not intentionally, or if maybe you don't indulge in reckless behavior because your friends don't either. So I think a lot of the time, peer pressure, even though it shouldn't, it does make you the person that you are, I would say. But I think that goes in both negative and positive ways. So, as I mentioned before, when you surround yourself with people who are reckless instead of, supportive and good, I think then it becomes a toxic situation where peer pressure is negative. And I think generally speaking, you will know when that peer pressure is good or bad, because I think that's just a part of your gut feeling or conscience that everyone has, especially as you grow older and you're in high school and you know more about, separating right from wrong. And I think generally speaking, the negatives of peer pressure are just that you're still being influenced by someone else. So you're not actually doing something because you want to do it. Even if you're breaking a bad habit, you're not doing it actually because you want to be a better person, but because you're trying to gain validation from someone else, which can be seen as both negative and positive. And either way, whether it's positive or negative, a lot of the time it still affects your mental health, it affects your behavior and your mindset, because you just don't depend as much on yourself. You don't allow yourself to grow on your own. And you kind of rely on other people's opinions and their, their influence to lead you to make the decisions you make. And so I think even for just society in general, it doesn't just have to be friends. When you see everyone on social media and you see, these trends that you feel like you have to follow because everyone else, not just your friends, are following it. I think that's when peer pressure is more focused on making you feel like you have to fit in. And that's all just because you don't want to be judged by people and you want people to respect you. But I think that's kind of where it becomes negative. Even positive peer pressure, I guess you could say, has negative aspects to it.
Yeah, I really like how you worded that. I think so often that we in a society like this try to be liked by others, and we often go with the herd just so we are judged in a positive way. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how can someone identify whether the peer pressure they're experiencing is negative or positive?
Yeah, so great question. I think I talked a little bit about this just now, but I think you would usually, when you're older, I'm sure everyone like listening to this podcast will most likely know how to separate right from wrong. So I think when you do come across a situation where you feel pressured into doing something, you'll be able to kind of tell if it's positive or not. So if you're coming across a situation where you're doing something kind of risky and in a negative way, or something that's dangerous and is dangerous and people say it's dangerous, that could be a sign of, a red flag. But if you just think about it, whatever situation you're in and you have a doubt of some sort, a concern maybe, and you know that at least some part of it is wrong, that's also just a red flag, because that kind of gut feeling is telling you like what you're pressured to do isn't a positive thing. I think positive peer pressure is more so changing for the better, even if it isn't your own decision. Or, just being more responsible, being a better person, breaking bad habits. But I think if you're doing it for someone else and you're not actually doing it because you want to do it, that's just a sign that it's not healthy for your mental health.
So I know you already kind of briefly mentioned this, but like, what are some more things that can happen as a result of peer pressure? Like, how can someone be affected by it?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said before, there is this domino effect. I think when one person sets some sort of trend, people continue to follow it, and then those people who follow it end up influencing more people to follow it. And it just keeps going on until everyone feels like they have to do it. And a lot of the time, you do it just so you don't have to worry about being in the spotlight, and like not the good type of spotlight, but the type of negative spotlight. And all you really get in return for, trying to fit in is just a bunch of unnecessary stress that impacts your mental health and impacts your ability to be able to make decisions for yourself. Um, and you end up, I mean, I guess you end up kind of having to wear a mask in a sense, or maybe just bring a lot of worry into your life that really has no need to be there. And as soon as one person wears a mask, more people wear the mask. And for example, you can kind of see that on social media where everyone always presents the best side of themselves. And so you kind of end up having a distorted image of what's actually good or right or needed, because it isn't actually your decision. It's just the decision you feel like you have to make in order to live a happier life. Um, and I think especially when everything is so normalized, that's one of the main causes of how younger children can be exposed to peer pressure early on as well. So I think that's just a huge problem in today's society.
Definitely, Aline. And I like how you brought up that really at any age you can experience peer pressure. You don't have to be in high school or working. We can be as young as 5 to experience these things.
Mhm.
So, what are some tips and advice you have for someone who is experiencing negative peer pressure?
Well, I think that the main thing is just learning how to say no. I think you need to know that you are responsible for making your own decisions and that no one else really should be making your life decisions for you. Sometimes it's good to have like a little bit of influence, obviously, the good type of influence. And you need to make sure that whoever is influencing that decision is part of like a positive, supportive support group. And I know everyone says this, but it really just doesn't matter what other people think of you or the decisions that you make. Because if you give in to peer pressure, it really, even though it feels like it doesn't, it just makes you unhappy and doubtful. And it kind of puts this distorted image in your head. But by not giving into peer pressure and learning how to say no to certain things, that's when you can actually have the opportunity to be happy. But that's only if you believe that you don't need anyone else's validation. And I think it's really hard to ignore judgment. Like, personally, for me, I know it's really hard to ignore what everyone else is doing or what everyone else thinks, or just to be okay with what other people think of you in general. But I think it's super important to know that it's also okay to take your time in learning how to do that. Take your time in learning how to say no. Take your time to learn how to, you know, create your own decisions and, curate your own path. Um, and just really finding people who make you feel safe and comfortable while you learn how to, say no and go through this entire process of learning how to not let peer pressure affect you.
Thank you so much, Allene, for that advice. So, what are some signs that parents or other loved ones can recognize that tell them their family member or friend is being influenced by peer pressure? And what are some ways that they can help their loved ones be less susceptible to negative peer pressure?
Well, first, I think it's really important to remember that peer pressure becomes a struggle for a lot of people at a really young age. So I think everyone just needs to be ready for it early on, especially if you're a parent and you have a child who is still young, because that peer pressure could come at any time. So I think some signs of that could be when you see your child starting to care about what they look like or what they own or possess, and the material possessions that they have, and they start to worry about that. Or maybe they just really start to care about the small things, kind of like what I said earlier about the backpack situation. And I think some other red flags would just be finding that your child or loved one doesn't really seem the same. I think there's a lot of signs like aggression, mood swings, behavioral changes. All of these can be first time signs, and it happens to everyone. So it's definitely not something to um, make your child feel like they have to be ashamed of. So I think the best thing that you can do in this situation is just listen to that person, whether it's your child, a friend, a loved one. I think they don't want to immediately hear that they're being, unreasonable, and they're what they're worried about isn't such a huge problem. I mean, it's obviously important for them to know that, but I think the main thing is that you have to listen to their concerns first, because um, especially when you have a child who's really young, they need someone who's willing to listen to, their side, because obviously different age groups understand things in different ways. So I think having real conversations and talks are the best thing that you can do. And obviously not just those one-sided conversations. I think it takes both the parent and the child's cooperation to deal with something as toxic as peer pressure.
That is some great advice, Allene. I'll be sure to use it in the future to remind my friends and stuff. So adding on, what demographic do you think is most likely to be the most susceptible to peer pressure and the least susceptible to peer pressure, such as age, gender, how popular someone is, and etc.?
Yeah, I 100% believe that it's mostly in youth. And I know, like, 100%, like, guys face peer pressure all the time too. And I think with all this social media, all these things that are normalized that shouldn't be normalized are really affecting a lot of young women the most. Um, and I think everyone faces peer pressure, even adults, in the workplace or in situations with friends. A lot of, pretty much, like, all demographics face some kind of peer pressure in their lives. But I think it really comes down to the youth. And I think that means high school, middle school. That's where peer pressure is kind of the most prominent. And it doesn't just have to be peer pressure about, the number of friends you have or what you wear or how you act. It can also be about grades and about school. I think lots of people feel like, the main demographic is just someone popular who has to fit in, or someone who is, really focused on social media and what they're posting and things like that. But I think a lot of the time peer pressure can come in these different forms. So even people who are completely different and they prefer to kind of keep to themselves, or they prefer to, care more about their academic life, I think there's a ton of peer pressure that comes with that as well, as I talked a little bit about before, especially if you attend a competitive high school. And I do think still that, unfortunately, social media does do a good job at normalizing peer pressure. Um, and that includes, the pressure to get the most likes, comments, the best photos, the most followers, and so on. So it's really just making something that isn't a contest into a contest. And especially when people are young and still learning how to be independent and learning how to say no and make their own decisions, it can really be hard to ignore peer pressure in these types of situations. And I think because social media is so prominent, especially among teens and, specifically young women, I think that's why I feel like young women are hit the hardest, because of all these different stereotypes that they have to fit into, or these different normalized trends that they have to follow. Whereas I think maybe for a grown adult, they're a bit more mature and old enough to know how to make their own decisions. They understand a little bit more how to deal with peer pressure. And even though peer pressure still takes place in the workplace or just in society in general, when you grow older, you kind of learn to understand that you learn to understand that it isn't as big of a deal to impress other people with the little things in life. Whereas when you're younger, everything kind of makes it normalized to feel like you have to, follow what other people think of you or base your decisions off of that.
For sure. And final question, do you have any personal experiences regarding peer pressure that have changed who you are today?
Well, I think in general, I attend a pretty competitive school where, at least in my class, um, everyone is really skilled, really intelligent, and talented. And I think it can be really tough to keep up at times. A lot of my own friends also are just so incredibly talented and so smart. And going into high school, I really felt like everyone was doing so much more than me, and it made me feel like I had to keep up. And then, of course, there was this idea planted in my head um, by parents, friends, peers that I had to go into STEM or had to go into computer science just because everyone kept telling me that it was the future and that it was my only option. That was how I was going to, get the best stable career. Um, and of course, computer science and tech is really important nowadays, but a lot of people aren't necessarily tech savvy people in the sense of coding and computer science, hands-on engineering, and I'm definitely not one of those people either. And I think there are so many different options out there that I really didn't consider because I felt like I kind of had to do what everyone else was doing. And I had tried classes and courses related to coding and computer science, and I found out that not only was I like not great at it, but I just didn't really enjoy it at all. And I think, of course, basics of it all are super great to know and can be pretty fun and especially useful. But I'm not someone who's great at spending hours figuring out complex coding competition problems or, coding my own app. And I feel like I still had to do all of this stuff that I just didn't want to spend my time doing just because other people were doing it and there were people who wanted me to do it too. So I think as time kind of went on, I realized that I didn't want to focus my time on something that I wasn't good at and that I actually didn't want to do. So I kind of explored my options. I found a lot of different activities that I actually loved to do. And it kind of was just a fresh reminder for me that I don't need to do something just because I feel like I have to do that. And especially when you're not getting any joy out of making a decision that you're making, that's just a sign that it's not something you should be doing. And I guess it kind of reminded me that not everyone is born to be like amazing coders, or not everyone is given the same set of skills and abilities. And if it were like that, where everyone was kind of the same, they had the same skills, they kind of had the same interests, they had all of these same things, the world would be kind of way more empty than it is, I would say. And I think that's why it's so important to embrace your differences or just embrace the person you choose to be instead of letting peer pressure kind of take over all of that.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. So, Allene, is there one final message or advice that you would like to let the listeners leave off with?
Well, I think a good place to end and leave off with is just the message that you are in charge of what you do and what you say and who you are. And I think while there is good pressure, more commonly there's a lot of negative peer pressure. And so it's really just up to you in the end to make the final decision in any situation. Like no one actually has a hold on what you're supposed to do, especially when it comes to a decision that risks losing even any tiny little part of you. I think it's really just important to remember that being authentically you is what actually brings flavor and diversity into this world.
Thank you. We've learned a lot today about peer pressure and how it affects people's everyday lives. Hopefully, today we were able to address some myths about peer pressure and give everyone a better understanding of what this phenomenon is.
Once again, we would like to thank our guest speaker, Allene. We sincerely appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Some of us can be swayed by the pressure of the people around us, and some are a little more stubborn. However, being aware of the good and bad types of peer pressure and knowing what to do in these situations will be the thing that can really change the type of person we are.
Once again, thank you everyone for listening to today's episode of Basically Everything. We hope you enjoyed this episode and were able to learn about peer pressure and that you have new insights about this topic. Make sure to follow us on our social media accounts and don't forget to check out our website, all linked in the description.
As always, have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.